is the background intro we had from RA on standards. These were all discussed briefly, and in Canada, the most clear emerging standard is the FCOP, or the Forest Carbon Offset Protocol of British Columbia. I know it's being looked at very carefully by Quebec and Ontario. We may see it in other provinces as well, and it's a framework which leads me to some of the key points I want to make. So when we compare these potentially applicable standards in Canada, the CDM, of course, you can't apply in Canada, but FCOP CAR is busy developing some protocols for Canada in both agriculture and forestry. It's just letting the tenders for that, but that's within 18 months to 2 years. The California standards can be hosting projects here and that are tradable within California and potentially with other players in Western Climate Initiative. The voluntary carbon standard has set itself up for Canada, and Carbon Fix is prepared to host projects in Canada, and of course CDM is just a good reference. So when you look at these projects, they have different start dates, different eligibility criteria, different additionality criteria, baseline. There's some differences. They all use the same principle, structured approach, and the important thing about these standards, in my view, to think about when you're considering projects is the immensely challenging permanence period. If you're engaging with a forest to introduce an intervention for a land use change, you're talking about a commitment for a change to last 100 years or a change to involve 100 years. And that's true under all the standards except Carbon Fix, which also not only 50 years, but it permits ex post trading, and but it still has limited applicability, and it's attempting to align with CDM and be tradable within CDM, and it probably will achieve that at some point. But in Canada, largely we're looking at a 100-year permanent period, and we therefore have some big challenges. The other areas have challenges as well, but I'm going to suggest some of the things that have been brought up for us approaching projects or in recognizing successful projects involving the question of permanence, because I think that's one of the most challenging areas in any jurisdiction. It is for RED, it is for AR projects internationally, and it is in Canada. So permanence is introduced because forestry projects have to be present for at least 100 years. The carbon has to be out of the atmosphere for 100 years for a qualified credit, because it's replacing an emission which technically could be 300 years or 10,000 years. There's arguments that 100 years is really not enough. But we have a critical window for action for 2100. It used to be focused. It really is probably before 2050. We have to begin our removals now and begin them aggressively. And they need to be reasonably permanent removals, which is why there's been 100 years. And so the challenge with this concept of 100 years, and I'm using this analysis of land use types for largely British Columbia for the BC Forest Carbon Offset Protocol, but it's a Canadian precedent, and I think it applies in most of our provinces. The forest license will have 20 or 10 years. Technically, people have held forest licenses longer, there's a history of 50 and 60 years tree farm licenses, but really there is no certainty within the license. There's the annual allowable cut will fluctuate over those 50, 60 years when you map backwards. Commitment to a project within a 10-year system for 100 years is a significant challenge. Community forests have greater certainty in British Columbia, and there's even carbon rights associated with the forest, and it's more possible to conceptualize and develop projects, although there are still some 10-year term related to permanence period issues. Municipal lands, of course, there's no limit for how long a municipality can make a commitment around its land, but in reality, city planners find it very challenging to deal with 100 years and to say 50 years from now, no, we won't need this land for development, and yes, we can tie it up in a forest stand. Private land, of course, the conservation community has enormous experience, and conservation trusts deal with private land, and they deal with covenants on private land. So carbon projects, conservation projects integrate very well for carbon credits and 100 years permanence, and in the conservation trust there's lots of synchronicity. First Nation, of course, unless they have treaty settlement, has some challenges. The government is prepared to grant 100-year carbon rights, but there are some realities here that have to be considered. And of course, the government can turn something into parks, as long as really an additional action. But there's, there are other issues as well. But I think the 100-year period is a very interesting issue to think about. British Columbia has just indicated that the validation intervals will be extended from 10 years to 25 years, and that means that's a bit of a cost reduction initiative where I validate project, the validation doesn't expire for 25 years, and that's for all the four forestry protocols or interventions that are permitted in the forest. And it doesn't change the challenge, however, of the 100-year permanence requirements. And some of those requirements are, of course, resolving the timber tenure and permanence, synchronizing those timelines. But there's also challenges with the future forest ecosystem. Are you dealing with the ecosystem that will be there in 50 and 100 years? How do you think about that? Of course, we do regional land use planning, and that's well demonstrated by the impending success of a project on the Great Bear Rainforest. While the project took a few years to develop, the land use planning that preceded it, the agreements between industry and the environmental community and government, which took like a decade, are an essential prerequisite to really being able to say, this is a new conservation area and this is a continuing sustainable forest management area. And so integrated resource management, tenures, how do we think about managing resources such as carbon, forestry, and other values in an integrated way? That's a challenge, and we really are in an era of adaptive forest management, and we need to be thinking about the climate-adjusted prescriptions that we have to be through, and that should be in the planning. So unless all these things are integrated, and I'm going to talk about them very briefly, we have in the Northwest taken a future forest ecosystem study, and we've been doing the biometric modeling of what the ecosystem will look like in the future. What are the changes? What are all of the impacts on the values? We've done this also cooperatively in a parallel study with WWF, and this is our and Cochinchina resources.